everyone, and welcome to another episode of Music with the Maestro. I'm Anthony Blake Clark, the music director of Baltimore Choral Arts, and once again, for the second time, we have the great privilege of having my teacher and mentor and now dear friend, Simon Halsey from the UK. Hello, Simon. How's it going over there?
Hi, it's very good to be back. I'm very pleased to do a second turn with you all. I can't say things are terribly good in the United States or in the United Kingdom, but I'm just keeping smiling. After a very poor summer of very rainy weather, a lot of flooding and so on, we're getting an Indian summer now. The sun is shining brightly outside, and this is doing a little bit for my spirits.
Yes, good. Glad to hear that maybe the sun has come out. Good. I hope it's a good omen. So we are speaking today about one of my favorite things on the planet. This is William Walton's Belshazzar's Feast. So just to open things up, I probably shouldn't actually remind you of this in case you decide you want it back, but I have one of your vocal scores. And in this vocal score, I've come to discover that this is the one that you used during your recording. With the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra and the Cleveland Orchestra Chorus. There are things like a fair amount of Sir Simon Rattle noise. There are notes about balance. It's really, really fun to flip through. So that's one of my fun little things that I like to periodically look through when I listen to the Walton. So with that as the introduction to this question, please tell us, what is your experience with this piece over the years?
Well, my experience is very mixed with this piece, and I suppose I should just check that you people in the United States know this piece. I mean, is it done quite often?
No, hardly the I think part of it is that it's too big of a project to risk for people in this country because the audiences haven't heard of it. But I think it's my goal certainly to get this piece played as often as possible wherever I am, because it's one of my favorite things.
I know it's done occasionally. It was Andre Thomas's final concert at the university that he taught at in Tallahassee, and I was due to conduct it with the Dallas Symphony at the ACDA convention in 2020, but of course that's cancelled. The reason that this piece is not done except in the United Kingdom is, you're quite right, is that it's very expensive. And so the promoters need to be sure that it's going to sell out. And if no one knows it, it won't. And it's a real chicken and egg situation. In the UK, it's just about the most popular piece and the one thing that you can be sure to fill a hall with. But we have a number of pieces like that, because The Dream of Gerontius by Elgar is done occasionally outside the UK, but again is an absolute surefire winner for us. And we have a number of these pieces that somehow don't quite travel. Now the problem is this: it's huge. It has a very big orchestra, needs a big choir, and has 2 brass bands. And the reason for this is that in the 1930s, it was commissioned to be a companion piece to one of the big Berlioz pieces. And the conductor at the time told William Walton he might as well throw in all the possible instruments, because after all, it would never get done again. But it was an amazing success in Leeds in the 1930s in its first performance. I should just say to everybody, my rather dry and gravelly voice is because I don't get used to talking to anybody any longer. I used to spend hours with a well-oiled voice every day in choral rehearsals, and I've been sort of silent for 6 months. And just recently, activity has begun to ramp up a bit, and my voice just wasn't used to it. So I'm not sick, I'm just a worn-out old man. Now, it's very important that anyone watching this gets a recording of Belshazzar's Feast and listens to it. Robert Shaw did a good one, but it's Atlanta for Teldec, but did something very peculiar, which I completely understand. He did not like the fact that the choir ends before the orchestra. So the piece ends with an enormous orchestral chord in which the organ comes in and the whole world ends. and Shaw added the choir to the final chord, which is considered very, very bad behavior, but I do understand why he did it. There is a very good Andre Previn recording of it. There are lots of recordings of it. I think the Simon Rattle one with Cleveland and Birmingham is very good. It's the sort of piece that's often on the first or the last night of the proms, and it's only 35 minutes long, and it only has one soloist. So there are lots of YouTube recordings. Go and listen to it. Now, it tells a very gory story. Thus spake Isaiah, thy sons that thou shalt beget, they shall be taken away and be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Howl ye therefore, for the day of the Lord is at hand. And the text is quite short. It just runs to 4 pages and tells a biblical story. And Belshazzar the king is slain, his kingdom is divided, and everyone sings hallelujah.
If only it were that simple.
If only. Now, the piece begins for divided male chorus, which in my view is rarely a good idea. In modern choirs, as you know, we have more women than men normally. And so to begin a cappella with 4-part men, fortissimo, and then make them sing some very difficult music for a couple of pages, and then bring the orchestra in on the same chord, is a chorus master's nightmare. However, if you manage to do it, and I've recently more or less discovered how to do it, and that is to feature the basses and to get the tenors to sing lightly. I always used to allow it to be tenor-led, and there wasn't enough bass, and so the pitch wandered. I think I've got that sorted out. The piece also begins just like the Sea Symphony by Vaughan Williams, which is another piece you people may not know so well, but was another extremely popular sort of oratorio symphony from about 20 or 30 years earlier than this, setting the poem by Walt Whitman. This one, the text is arranged by Osbert Sitwell. If you want a real laugh, Google Osbert Sitwell. We're talking about the aristocracy here. It's dedicated to Lord Berners. If you don't know that name, Google it. Lord Berners was an aristocrat, a great friend of Stravinsky's. He was really quite a good composer, and he lived a very, sybaritic life, a life looking for pleasure, and would spend hours having lunch and hours painting his house. And Stravinsky once went there on a pink day, so that a whole flock of doves had been painted pink with food coloring. It's a laugh a minute. And if you want another introduction to Walton, listen to Facade, which comes either as a fantastic chamber music piece or as an orchestral suite with a narrator doing these fantastic poems with very perky and jazzy music. Now, Walton lived roughly the first 70 years of the 20th century, and had a tremendous facility. He found initially writing music very easy, and then it got harder and harder as he got older. This is an early piece. He was a great fan of jazz. He'd like Sir Michael Tippett and others. He'd listened to an awful lot of American music on the wireless in the run-up to the Second World War, for example. And the pleasures of the piece are that choirs love it. It takes a lot of rehearsal, but it's very expressive. It's very fast. It's loud. It's wildly exciting. The orchestration is hugely colourful. It has saxophones, contrabassoon. It's got lots and lots of clarinets, 5 clarinets in all. It's got 4 percussion players playing everything from slapsticks to anvils, 2 harps, a piano, organ, brass bands. It's half an hour of technicolor, of the sort of thing that if you were new to it, you could almost imagine that Bernstein had written.
Right.
And it has that same sort of facility, and their dates are quite similar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In fact, when one of the times that I've prepped this piece at the Kennedy Center, that's exactly what we did, is we did Chichester Psalms and then returned and did Walton. And it's marvelous how much they complement one another.
Indeed, indeed. Now, the difficulties are really perhaps rather boring for your audience. They're all to do with training the choir, getting a good balance, making sure the intonation is good, because the overall harmony is very familiar and sounds like all the music that we know. But there are some very colourful passages and some bits with an awful lot of difficult intervals and leaping around. So it's quite difficult to train it in the choir. Good things, it sets the language, the English language, very well. Thus spake Isaiah, thy sons that thou shalt beget, they shall be taken away and be eunuchs. So it sounds like spoken English, and that in my book's good. And he got that from Henry Purcell. He'd got that from Edward Elgar. There are 2 choirs, and there's a lot of competition between them, which is absolutely fine, but it's a bit exhausting towards the end. And it's the sort of music in which there are an awful lot of gaps. So the choir has to know it very well, otherwise they fall into the gaps. Let me just show you. Yes. In Babylon, Belshazzar the king made a great feast, made a feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. And if any one person gets any bit of rhythm wrong, they have egg all over their face.
Yeah, and you're right. It just requires an intense amount of rehearsal. I feel like for a 34-minute piece, by the end of it, you felt like you've prepped a 3-act opera.
Yes.
And
it feels very much longer. There are 120 pages in the vocal score. It feels like a big piece. But by the end, the tempo marking is 208 big beats in a minute, which means they're going hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. So it's a wild, wild ride. And I'll tell you something else that it prefigures. It prefigures some of those extraordinary pieces by John Adams, Fast Machine and things like that. Pieces that have an enormous amount of speed and velocity and are rushing towards a fascinating and extraordinary conclusion.
Certainly. I think, and just to sort of reiterate something that you hinted at, although intervallically and all the rest of it, it feels quite disjointed as a singer, quite disjunct, etc. Walton actually, most of the time, is in an absolute sort of tangible key center. You know, it ends up sounding mostly like traditional Western music, although, you know, it's very Hollywood, and the orchestration is very lush, but it does, for an audience perspective, it feels like just a traditional Western piece that you'd come to listen to from the mid or early 20th century. And the orchestration is just magical to me.
The orchestration is fantastic. One of the things is, of course, he was a film composer. He did the music for a number of Shakespeare films by Laurence Olivier. He also did a marvelous opera called Troilus and Cressida that was given very often in the past, and it still should be in the canon of important 20th century operas. So he turned his hand to everything. He'd been a choir boy in Oxford. I was a choir boy in something called New College, Oxford, and he was a choir boy at Christ Church, Oxford, which is a different college about 800 meters away. I should add he was there several generations before me, but he'd grown up in English church music, and there is a whole load of lovely sacred music, settings of the canticles. There's a Missa Brevis, there are several anthems, there are some Christmas carols. So he did all that. He also wrote 2 glorious symphonies, a fabulous cello concerto, a fabulous viola concerto. He wrote a number of occasional pieces that are very important, pieces for the coronation of the present Queen in 1952, 53, and a number of very splendid and showy overtures. As his facility began to fail a bit later in life, he'd made a lot of money. He'd retired to the island of Ischia in the Mediterranean. His wife, Lady Walton, had created a glorious garden. I can't think of any reason why they would have wanted to leave home at all. He began to rather repeat himself, in my view, so that some of the later church music and occasional music, you think you've heard it before from him. But that happens to all sorts of composers, doesn't it? I mean, Rossini worked at white hot heat and was more or less retired in his 40s. Handel was doing quite a lot of retreading later on in his life, putting secular words to putting sacred words to secular pieces that he'd previously written, and so on and so on. And why not? But there's all sorts of nice sort of monographs and so on about Walton, and he's someone who is very easy to follow if you want to get a new passion for a great composer who is not as well known perhaps as he should be.
Absolutely. I mean, especially particularly with an American audience. I mean, when I first came to England, Walton was always a touchstone of my experience in the UK, because when I first started in the master's course, I think one of the first things we did at the CBSO course was Belshazzar's Feast, and we did it with the BBC Philharmonic, and we did a tour. I think it was a little regional place, and then Manchester twice, perhaps. And then at the end of my time, towards the end of my time, I was sitting in on a rehearsal of Walton 1 with Simon Rattle conducting the LSO, and I mean, it just opened up this Pandora's box of me becoming a huge Walton fan, and it's a good rabbit hole to go down. So I would encourage everyone to listen. So let's transition to the actual the meat of the piece. What are your favorite parts? What are the real downfalls? Let's start somewhere close to the beginning. We've already
somewhere close to the beginning.
Yeah, we've already spoken about
the opening for men's chorus unaccompanied is difficult.
Yes.
This is followed by quite a long introductory passage that again he keeps on taking the orchestra out, though in the orchestra score it's all doubled with asterisks saying don't play unless you have to, but clearly he knew there were going to be intonation issues. Once you're clear of all that, and I must say, that the choral instrumentation is beautiful. I mean, the way he uses high voices and low voices, the way he pits men against women, and so two choirs against each other is just beautiful. For me, it really gets going once he's given us the introduction and introduced the bass soloist, when we come to figure 15. Now, there's no reason why anyone should have a score, but only a little way into the piece. So there are, let's have a look, 78 figures. So it's only 20% of the way into the piece. It really begins. So it's like you've had a first orchestral symphonic movement that was introductory, and then he describes Babylon. Belshazzar the king made a feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Whilst he tasted the wine, he commanded us to bring the gold and silver vessels, yea, the vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple that was in Jerusalem. And they have the most fantastic feast. And the music is so wonderfully jazzy. So it goes in the orchestra, and that's very Stravinsky already. And there's a tremendous, you could just go in Babylon, but he goes in Babylon, so that everybody is waiting to see where on earth you are. And it's this marvelous exchange between the orchestra, Babylon, Belshazzar the king made a great feast before the 1,000, and then the orchestra leaps in again. And for the orchestra, the notes actually are not terribly hard as long as you have a good slow run through of it first. I did it with the orchestra in Jacksonville a few years ago, and I decided, because they'd never seen it before, I would simply read it through very slowly. So I did, for which they were very grateful. It just gave them time to get it under their fingers. But interestingly, even on the second reading, ramping up the speed a great deal, they didn't have much trouble with it. In the end, they played it splendidly. So the thing about it is that the choir parts, though difficult, lie in the voice. Yeah. And the orchestral parts lie under their fingers. So it's real musicians' music.
So the only people that will have the trouble is the conductor.
It's very hard for the conductor. I mean, not for people like Simon Rattle, but I have to do a tremendous amount of preparation on a piece like this. And it can be quite difficult to balance because there's a lot of brass. So I particularly enjoy these fast bits, which, if you like, are the central big second movement of the piece. But I also like the way he uses orchestra alone, choir a cappella, unaccompanied solo voice, so you can hear every word, and how splendid the organ part is. So you get fanfares, and then the baritone solo says, "Praise ye the God of gold." And then the choir sings it like a hymn at a great celebratory Christmas service. And then the orchestra goes completely crazy and everyone joins in with it.
Isn't it just
rather like a sort of church anthem? There's an awful lot of praise ye the God of this, praise ye the God of that, which, if only it was praise the Lord our God, could be part of evensong or the Mass. Right. But of course it's tremendously secular and rude. The place is full of serving wenches, wine, gold, silver, harlots, and general bad behavior. And this is tremendous fun.
And isn't it just...
One of the things that's then fun is that you think it's going well, and then he starts adding the brass bands. Now, the brass bands are somewhere a long way away, so the public, you then see them all going. If you watch me on the screen, they'll all be looking forward, enjoying it, and suddenly they'll start going... to see where these brass instruments are coming from. And they're a long way away. This is something you get in Verdi Requiem as well, 2 offstage trumpets. You get it to a certain extent in Britain War Requiem. You get it in all the Mahler symphonies, things off stage, closing doors and so on. And these tremendous brass bands play at enormous speed at a huge distance. So getting it all to hang together would be difficult if our colleague professional musicians weren't so extraordinarily able to play slightly ahead of the beat, so that for the public it sounds just right. So it's never a problem, but I'm always expecting it to be.
Right.
And this huge section climaxes after hundreds of pages. Look how I'm turning the pages. But after only 10 minutes or so, and then the middle movement is sung by the bass soloist, and that's only 2 pages of my orchestral score, but it takes quite a long time in comparison to the 96 pages of orchestral score that comes before it. The next 2 with the bass soloist alone takes almost the same amount of time. And the most famous bit is this. I'll read the text. And in that same hour as they feasted came forth fingers of a man's hand, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And this is what was written: Mene mene tekel upatharim, which means thou art weighed in the balance and found wanting. So we know that Belshazzar is going to be destroyed. And in that night, Belshazzar the king was slain, says the soloist, and all the brass instruments, percussion instruments, and all the choir go. Get ready, everyone. Don't jump out of your seat. Go slay. It's just a staccato 8th note. And the choir has to yell as loud as it can, and all the brass and percussion instruments just go whack. Now, there are all sorts of precedents for this. In The Dream of Gerontius by Elgar, when Gerontius, who is every man, you and me, sees God, it is so shocking that there's just this clap in the orchestra where it says everyone is to play for a millisecond as loud as they possibly can. And that is so terrible that then God clouds over again and we never see him again. Britain War Requiem, at the absolute climax, Liber me, free us, the whole orchestra plays a G minor chord as loud as it can, including the only chord that the big organ plays. And that's a similar moment. So a British oratorio is very good at the big moment, and this is it. Now, I'm sure you've never heard of him, but there was a German emigre to the United Kingdom exactly 100 years ago, born 100 years ago, called, in the English way of pronouncing his name, Gerald Hoffnung. Gerald Hoffnung. He came from Germany. He died aged only 34. His daughter is in the London Symphony Chorus. His son is a very prominent timpani player in London. But he was a man of enormous invention. He did beautiful cartoons. So look up the word Hoffnung, Hoffnung. It means hope in German. Look him up. Marvelous musical cartoons, pictures of orchestras and choirs fooling about, and soloists and ridiculous instruments, and birds trying to feed choir members whose mouths are open, soloists with enormous bosoms, basses with enormous cavernous throats with steps going down into their stomachs and so on. Just marvelous. And he used to hire the Royal Albert Hall, seat 6,000 people in London, and do festival concerts. And he wrote a concerto for 4 Now we call them hoovers. What do you call a hoover?
Yeah. Vacuum cleaners, yeah.
Vacuum cleaner. 4 vacuum cleaners and orchestra. It's an absolute hoot. And one of the things he would do was he would do excerpts from the great works. And the excerpt from Belshazzar's Feast was the entire orchestra and chorus would just go, and wait for it, everyone, slay! And that was the excerpt from Belshazzar's Feast, and he'd move on to something else. So the piece has been at the center of our consciousness and our humor for very many years. Once he's been killed, everyone has a tremendous party. And with the 2 choirs yelling at each other left to right, the brass band's going crazy at the back of the hall, and everyone singing Hallelujah as fast as they possibly can. That's undoubtedly my favorite bit. But can I now tell you a secret, which is that because of the difficulties of training this piece, I don't like it very much.
Yeah. The whole piece? You don't like the whole piece at all?
I know that my choirs love it. You know, when it goes down on the list, everyone's more excited than when anything else goes down on the list. I know that it will be sold out in half an hour. Yeah. I know that the world is full of people who can conduct it very well, and that orchestras enjoy it, and that it will be met by an instant standing ovation. So, Kennedy Center, Baltimore, it's time for you all to get together and do it together and do massed performances up and down the East Coast of the United States. When the halls are open, take it to Carnegie Hall, take it to everywhere, to Boston and so on, up the Eastern Seaboard. Because once you've done it, people will be enthusiastic enough and will remember it and want to repeat it. I recently did a similar program to this in the UK, and I was asked how I felt about this piece, and I said rather strongly that I didn't want to do it again, because I did it at the proms last year with my choir from Spain and my London Symphony chorus, and the concert was glorious, but oh, how I suffered in the rehearsals. This was very controversial, and it went the rounds of social media, but luckily no one saw me because there were no rehearsals. I get my first ever real rehearsal tonight, and I hope no one is still nursing a grudge that I said I didn't like Belshazzar's Feast. It's rather like saying you don't like your, you don't like your country or your flag or something.
Well, before we wrap up, I want our audience to, we've listened to a few clips already, but I want our audience to listen to this marvelous Alleluia section back and forth armed with the knowledge that what Walton does here is really something extraordinary with tempo. And I think he's taken a page out of Mahler's book in that he's done a massive sort of tempo modulation over the course of 4 or 5 minutes, and so it's hardly noticeable. But at the beginning of the second version of the then sing aloud, from there to the end, it's a massive sort of giant accelerando, right? And yep. I think it's quite hard to pull off, and I think the recording with you lot and Simon Rattle is probably the best in regard. And
well, Simon Rattle has a great ability to do enormous long arches. There is a similar one, if we can just talk about English music today, in the War Requiem, where the last movement is very long and is an endless accelerando, and where you have to get the math exactly right. And he is someone who every time you land on a new metronome mark, he's on it. And one of the things about these 20th century composers, Walton, Stravinsky, Britten, and so on, is that, of course, they did have modern metronomes. They were all conductors in their own rights, and so that the tempos they wrote are the ones they actually wanted, could actually conduct themselves, and were as a result of having performed the piece, rather than going earlier where we can't really be quite sure what sort of condition a pendulum was in and so on. So you can, as a conductor, practice for hours this bit, just getting from bit A to bit B and then checking your metronome to see. And after a while, it becomes second nature. But if you're having trouble holding it all together, or people are a bit behind the beat or something, you may not make your meeting point, as it were, for your next tempo, and then you're playing catch up forever. So rattle does indeed get it just right.
It's incredible. So it's just a marvelous piece. I hope that people take this talk and use it as the beginning of going down a rabbit hole with Walton and with this piece. So let's listen to the end then, and also listen out for the huge crash of the organ in the last just 2 measures. It just sort of blows up the whole world. So let's take a listen, but before we do, I just want to say thank you again for being here for a second time. And for many of the people watching, it's not just the second time, because they've had a whole week of Mahler 8 with you in person in the UK. So we're still sort of beaming and shining from that. So thank you all around.
Well, can you imagine that we would ever do Mahler 8 again in the present circumstances? It's something that keeps us going in Birmingham every day. Well, at least we did that before the world closed down. So let's see what happens next time.
We will do it again, I know for certain.